This
guys?
conference will now be recorded.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So
Yes,
let me
sir.
start by, yeah, thank you. Thanks for that. So let me start by creating a resource group. I'll say VM sample. I'll say ECS, not a problem. I'll say review and create. Created, great. Let me go ahead and again start creating a virtual machine. So I'll say it is Windows Server 2019. And while creating, let's quickly review the options out here. So name of the VM, VM1, ECS2, great. Please hold this option right now. We're not going to cover this out. It's called no redundancy infrastructure required. So we'll just say no redundancy infrastructure required. Image version, you can pick up from a different versions of image. So I'll say it is 2019 data server. And the sizes, you can select the sizes and you can select from a series of size out here. And Sanjay, to answer your question, if I go for a DS1 V2 series, right, I'll get a temporary storage of about 7 GB. So it depends upon what kind of a series that you're actually choosing out. If you're going for a DS3 V2 storage, right, which is coming with 14 GB RAM, you'll get a 28 GB temporary drive. Does this clarify your doubt?
Yes, I got it. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll select the series of machine. I'll say, okay, I'll select this out. I'll say test user. I'll say Microsoft -001, Microsoft -001, confirm the password and ID. Now I'll say, okay, fine. The ports, what I'm selecting right now, I'll say I want to do an RDP into this machine. I want to log into this machine. And I also want to open up my HTTP port. Or let's not open this up. Let's keep it that way. I'll say it's RDP port. And I'll say this is the only port that I want. I'll say next disks. I'll basically take the default options that I'm getting here. I'll say networking. And I'll also go ahead and choose, let's say, a new network. I can go ahead and create a new network or an existing one. I'll say management. I'll switch off this boot diagnostic option because I don't need this at this point. I'll say review and create. Now, if you look at this, guys, it's called patch orchestration option, right? Automated by the OS, meaning your operating system kind of gets regular updates, right? So does your hardware. For that, you have something called as an agent version, what Sanjay was asking before we started the class. It's called as an agent version. I'll also show you how it looks like. I'll say advanced. I'll select nothing out here and I'll say review and create. So let me click on create out here. So it's like validating all the options that I'm choosing out here. And it will say, okay, fine, you are right. Go ahead and create it out. So I am now sending a request to Azure. I'm sending a request to Azure to help me create a virtual machine out here. Now let's do a quick recap on what, let's say, is the architecture of the virtual machine. So you need a virtual network, a subnet, and then the first thing that gets created is what? A NIC card. And a NIC card gets a private IP assignment from the subnet in which it is living in. You have a public IP address that gets assigned if you selected a public IP out there, or if you did not, you do not have a public IP out there. Lastly is your virtual machine, and to your virtual machine you can attach the NIC card, the data drives, and all these in turn get attached to the subnet. And in order to control what comes inside your network and what leaves your network, you can basically use something called as network security group rules. And whatever we declare, right, open this particular port and open this particular port and etc., everything gets assigned at the network security group level. So this is how the virtual machine gets created. So if you look at this, it says network security group rule and all that stuff. It creates all these things. It created a NIC card, assigned everything to the NIC card, and then that NIC card was assigned to the virtual machine. And now the virtual machine is going to take the IP, public and the private, from that particular NIC card, from that particular network interface card. Guys, are everyone clear on this one? Like, there are no doubts on this, right? The architecture of the virtual machine. Now, the reason I'm emphasizing this so much is because while you're automating things out, meaning while you're writing a PowerShell script or while you're creating a virtual machine using, let's say, an ARM template, an Azure Resource Manager template, you'll have to understand what are the dependencies that you're considering out. Like you'll have to understand which resource depends on what. So that is the reason I'm making sure that this is like very clear for everyone. So great, I have a public IP assigned. I also opened up something known as a RDP port, which is great until now. So I have a VM that is running on a Windows 2019 data center. It's a server. Okay. Now, what do I do with this machine? Question is, what do I really do with this machine? Now, I am creating this machine for one specific purpose, and that particular purpose is that I want to host my applications. Let's say Facebook.com or irctc.com. I need an infrastructure at the end, or I need someone to host my application on the internet. That is what the end of the day, that's what I really want to achieve, or that's what really an organization really wants to achieve. And right now, if I, let's say, go to this particular virtual machine, okay, if I take this particular public IP, and if I say browse into it, this particular public IP address is the home on which this particular virtual machine is actually residing on. And no matter how many times I do this, right now my browser is not responding, so let's see. So no matter how many times I do this, my browser will try to search what is there inside this particular public IP. Like, is there any sort of application inside this public IP, or is there any type of a content that I can expose out to the world? And no matter how many times it kind of does it, at the end of the day, it'll give you an error page, something like this: the site cannot be reached, it took too long to respond, please check your firewall, and etc. It's just simply telling you that, hey, you know what, I don't understand what this site is about. There is nothing in there. Like, you just created a machine, and even the machine doesn't know what it needs to do. Even this particular virtual machine you created doesn't know what it needs to do. So what you need to do right now is that I want to right now convert this virtual machine into an application server, or into an app server. Server, nothing but who's serving your application, who's basically holding your code and giving it out there to the world. And for Windows, especially when you talk about Windows, you need to install something called as an IIS, Internet Information Service. This is how I tell the virtual machine that, hey, you know what, you're not a plain box, or you're not just a simple virtual machine, but rather you're an application server. This is called an IIS role. I want to assign a role called IIS on top of the server. And once I assign a role called IIS on top of the server, this virtual machine will automatically know that, hey, you know what? Okay, now I have a role, or basically I have an assignment called IIS. Now I am not just a server, but I am an application server, meaning the user wants me to perform this particular duty. So how do I do it? Let me erase this particular drawing out here. Let me basically go into my normal mode. Let me come down out here. And firstly, in order to do that, I'll RDP into this machine. So I'll say MSTSC, or I'll basically type in remote desktop connection, given the public IP here, and I'll say, okay, fine. The user is test user. And now it says, okay, fine. It gives me the screen. I'll go inside this particular machine. And now, guys, this is not a home
Shivam,
operating system.
sorry to interrupt you.
Mhm. Yeah, please go ahead. Hello. Hello. Did someone have any questions? Guys, are you able to hear me?
Shivam, is it audible now?
Yeah, it's
Hello.
audible now. It's audible now. Yeah, Sridhar, it's audible now.
Yeah, Kiran, I got one question. Is it audible
Sure.
now?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, Kiran, my doubt is, you enter some credentials to connect
Mhm.
to remote desktop, right?
Right.
Yeah, those are the credentials we give when we are creating a virtual machine. We enter some username and password. Those
Correct.
are the same credentials you enter now. Welcome to remote desktop.
Yes. Yes, they are those are the same
Oh,
credentials I'm entering right now.
okay, Kiran. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, fine. So I've entered my administrator credentials, and as and when I logged in, right, I basically am presented with something called as server manager dashboard. This operating system also understands that it's not a home operating system, it's a server, meaning with a lot of restrictions. Now, if you want to, like, if you do not, normally what happens is, like, when you create a Windows 2019 or 2016 server, the screen comes right up. But if it just doesn't come up, go to this particular panel and say server manager. As in, when you type in server manager, you'll get an option called server manager desktop application. So you can go ahead and click this and you'll get the same screen out here. This is the screen where I can assign a role or a feature to my particular Windows server. So what I'll tell my Windows server right now is that, hey, you know what? I'll add a role. I'll click here to add roles and etc. I'll say, okay, fine. There are particular terms and conditions basically out here. I'll say, okay, that's great. I'll say next. It's asking me what is the installation type. My installation type right now is a role based or a feature based installation. It's not a VDI. What a VDI is, that's something that we don't need at all. So it's a role based or a feature based installation that basically I am going for. It says great. What is the role or what is the server firstly? I'll say this is the server. This is the only server that I have basically. So I'll select this particular server called VM1, which has a private IP address of 10.1.0.4 and running on a Microsoft Windows Server 2019 operating system. And I'll say this is a server, yes. I'll say now it's asking me what are the roles. I have a lot of roles out here. Like I can do a lot of things. Like this particular server, what you created, can do a lot of things out here. But what are you really looking for? I am looking for a specific role called IIS or a web server or an application server also. This is the particular role or this is the specific role that I want to assign to this particular server. I'll click OK. Please assign this. I'll say add. I'll say next. And everything here, I'm not touching anything out here, like all the default features, but basically that come with the IIS role. I'm okay with that. I'll say next. I'll say okay, fine. I agree to the terms and condition. I'll say next. And in the role services, I'll just come down and select something called as a management service so that I'll be able to manage the entire IIS role that I'm creating out there. So I'll say management services. So I just selected two things, guys. One thing, web server IIS. Second thing, management services in the role services out here. I'll say next. It'll give me a confirmation page. I'll say okay, fine, install. Now what am I doing is firstly I opened this particular server, went into server manager and said role based access control or role based or feature based basically rules. What I did here is I said web server bracket IIS, Internet Information Services. This is the role when which gets assigned, when it gets assigned to the server or the virtual machine, this virtual machine gets turned into an application server. It's not a normal server right now. It's just not a normal box right now. It's an application server out there. Like, is that the only role? No. You can convert it into a DNS server. It can convert it into an Azure Active Directory, domain federation services. You can do a lot of things with this particular server. But let's focus right now on application server. We're also going to see how you can create a DNS server and how you can create a build machine and all that stuff. But let's focus upon this particular task out here. And what we did is we in the server roles we selected IIS, and in the role services we selected something called as management services out there. These are the only two things that I selected, and I said install. Now this is going to take somewhere around 2 minutes for the installation to be done. So after the installation, let's see what's going to happen. So it says, you know what, the feature has got installed, installation is complete, installation is done, successful. Now in the background, what happened is that after the installation has been done, I'll say close, and right now you have something called IIS. This wasn't there earlier. It said IIS. Now you are not a normal server, you are an IIS server. Now what can happen probably is that when I take this particular IP and when I now try to browse it, it will again give me the same error. Reason, guys, is that I have not opened the server up for the internet traffic. Meaning I have not opened the port on the server which allows it to, let's say, communicate with the internet. How can I then open? What can I do here is like, I can come down to the networking. I can say these are the inbound port rules. Now, one thing to observe, guys, is the priority number. These are default rules. I did not add them. This will come by default with any network security group. These are the default rules. We'll also talk about what default rules are and how basically you can play around with them and all that stuff. Now, what I'm going to do is I'll say add an inbound port rule for the internet traffic to come in. Meaning if someone basically wants to interact with the server on the internet, please allow them. For this, what I'll say is like, I'll say source is any, destination is any, not a problem. Service is HTTP. Automatically your port number gets changed to 80. And now carefully look at this. You have something called as a priority. You have an action called allow. I want to allow the traffic that is coming in over, let's say, a port called HTTP. And you have something called as a priority number. Priority can be between or can start from 100 and it can go, let's say, up to a larger number till 64,000 something. What really is priority? Let's say I give a priority of 100. I'll say port is 80. I'll say HTTP traffic allow. I'll say add. This will now start creating a rule with a priority called 100 out here. Meaning what happens is that the order of priority is pretty important out here. Let's give it a refresh so the rule gets reflected. The order of priority is important out here, meaning when Microsoft or when basically Azure is trying to evaluate what are the rules that are assigned or what are basically the ports that are assigned to this particular virtual machine, it will first see what is the priority. Priority 100, lesser the priority, greater is the weightage. The first rule that will get executed is port 80. This is the name of the rule. It says, okay, fine. Port 80, traffic is what? Allow. So I will allow it. I will, no matter what, I will allow it. Let's say I have a rule called 200 where I'm saying HTTP is deny. I am not allowing it, I'm denying it. What is going to happen? Port 100 is going, or basically priority 100 is going to take a higher priority out before 200. This is what is the order of priority. Now, popular questions is that, can I have another priority with 100 with a number called 100? No. You can have only one priority number assigned to one particular rule out there. We will discuss more on this, like NSG is like going to take one specific class, but I'm just giving a overview on what we are doing out here. So I have given a rule called 100 out here, and now let me see what is there in my server. Now I said allow this traffic. I'll now refresh this page. This is now giving me, hey, you know what? Traffic is now being allowed, meaning port 80 communications are open, meaning people can communicate with me over a port called port 80, which is HTTP, and I am giving you something known as an Internet Information Service, meaning it is now a web server with a role called Internet Information Services out here. How did I really get this image here? Like, what did I differently do out here? Meaning, I am here in IIS. I'll go ahead, do a right click. I'll say IIS Manager. Now we have installed something called as a management service, right? If you did not install it, you will not get this option. So that is the reason I went ahead and installed this out so that I can manage my IIS server. I'll say, okay, fine. Now it says, hey, you know what? This is a server. And under this server, I have a default website because this is an IIS right now. And under this default website, if you do a right click out there and say explore, you will be taken into a folder called Windows intpub www root. Whatever files are there in this particular folder is your code that needs to be displayed on the internet. Now this is the image what you guys are able to see on that particular page. Now let me say if I do something different on this particular image, I'll just say mark this up and I'll say test. I say save out here and I close this out. The same thing is getting displayed on the internet, meaning now anyone with a proper internet connection can go to this particular IP, which is 20.110.77.69, and they can browse for this particular file, meaning whatever changes that are there in this particular folder is something that you kind of see here. Then what can I do with this? So let me do one quick test out here to see whether this is really a server or not. I'll say download HTML template. I'll say fine, download this out. I'll basically take a any sample template out here. I'll say download. I'll download a zip file, which is like pretty quick, which is like some KBs out here. I'll copy this file out and paste it on my server somewhere in, let's say, the C drive. I mean, that will happen like really quick out there. So I'm like copying it from my local machine onto this particular server out here, and I'll just extract it out here. I'll say extract, and this is all the code basically, or this is all the files basically that I really need. So I'll just copy this out, copy the entire folder out, come down to C drive, again go back to this particular website or this particular folder called intpub, go into the root. I'll just delete these two files out and paste this out. Now if I do a refresh out here, you are getting a full-blown website. Like if you were a HTML developer, you could go ahead, change this code and host your website like this. The same thing where we did, guys, we did in something called as an Azure static website, right? In storage accounts. Then how is it different from, let's say, a virtual machine? Now, an Azure static website does not give you logging information on all these things, whereas a virtual machine can do all these things out. A virtual machines out there in the Azure is designed for one of these purposes, for hosting your code. So what I did again, installed IIS on top of the server, went into the folder called intpub. How do I go there? If we just start from here, you can basically click on IIS, do a right click here and say Internet Information Service Manager. Click here, go into sites. You will already have a default website out here. You can click here and say explore. You'll come to this page, or you can directly come to the C drive into this particular folder called npub into www root, and you will basically get a sample file called IIS start, which will basically give you, that blue color screen telling that, what, this is an IIS server. And now you can start hosting your code out here. Guys, is this okay? Any questions here, guys? Anything? Any quick questions that I can take, guys?
When we are copying any data from our machine to the VM,
Mhm.
is there any size limit?
No, there is no size limit as such. You can
Okay,
copy even gigabytes of data. That is not an issue.
okay.
Yeah, Kiran. So I'm good with the IIS web server.
Mhm.
So suppose I need a file server. I need to make that VM as a file server. So I installed a
Mhm.
file role,
Mhm.
file server role, and
Mhm.
I shared one folder,
Okay.
and I opened assembly port 445 in the NSG.
Mhm.
So can we access that file share from the outside the network, means through internet?
Yes, you can access it, provided if you allow there is something called ACL, access control layer. If you basically allow that to someone, then yes. Are you talking about the Azure file share in the Azure storage account?
No, I'm talking about within a VM. VM, I will share the one
Yes,
folder.
you can. You can share the network path, and you need to provide something called as an ACL, access control layer. Once you give that, whomever you give that, they can go ahead and access those files inside that.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Okay, guys, any more questions that I can take with this entire process? I hope you guys are comfortable, right? So IIS, I just did one simple thing. I went in IIS and I did basically install the role called IIS out there, open the folder called intpub www root, and put all my code in there. So whatever code was there, I just took that code and put in there, which is great, which is good but not great. Like in the real world, people really wouldn't go ahead and, let's say, start writing their code in HTML. Like, yes, there you can certainly use HTML for static content, but let's say if you're trying to develop a full-blown application, let's say you're trying to develop, let's say, an application which can actually go ahead and connect to a backend database and which can actually perform a lot of things, then HTML might not be the best choice for you. You can start developing in a language like a .NET or a Java or whatever is available out there. Now then, how do I develop it? The first thing, how do I develop it? Now, developers use a variety of set of tools like Eclipse, like Visual Studio, and etc. So I have something known as a Visual Studio 2019 server installed on my laptop. Like, this is a very big software. Unlike Visual Studio Code, which is a lighter version of it, it's a very big software. Like, it'll take somewhere around 12 or 14 GB of your computer space to have this installed. And this is how it'll look like. It'll say, hey, you know what? This is, let's say, a Visual Studio 2019 server. And what it says is that you can now start creating something called as a project out there. You can now start, let's say, doing something known as, create something known as a project out there. So I'll say, fine, I want to actually create a project. I'm actually a developer right now. I want to actually create a project. I'll say, okay, fine, create a project out here. And I can choose from a template. Like, there will be like many templates out there, to choose from. So what I'll do is I'll say, okay, fine, I want to create a project which is an ASP.NET Core, a language. I'll say, okay, fine, this is an ASP.NET Core. I'll say next. I'll say this is like, like a welcome, like a project name is like ASP.NET Core Proj or something like this. It says, okay, fine, your solution name is also this one. We'll see what a solution is and all that stuff. So it's like Right now I'm just creating a project. Now I'll say next. I'll say okay, fine. You don't need all these things out. I'll say create. So it says okay, fine. The framework is .NET Core 3.1 long-term support. So I'll just take that and I'll say next out here. And I'll say create. And as in when I do it, what it does is that it gives me something called as a boilerplate template, meaning a template that I can start developing on. But we're not here to develop things out. We are to see how you can use your server to host this particular code. That is what we are doing right now. Right. So this is a very sample code, a very simple code. And if I want to see how it looks like, I can click on something known as an IIS Express out here, and it will start debugging my code and it will start telling me that, hey, you know what? I can give you this code or this is how your code looks like. So let's see how it looks like. I just clicked on something known as an IIS Express out here. This will now basically take me to, let's say, a local browser, meaning it's just going to open a port called on my local browser. And this is on my local system. It's opening up a port and it is just trying to compile my entire code and display it out there. And once it is like done with that particular process, right, you'll be able to see a very sample website, something like this. Like this is home, privacy, and all that stuff. On top of it, you can start developing a lot of things. Now, this is the very basic, meaning this is a very basic template what a developer would start working with, right? Now, the thing here is that the issue with the entire thing is that if I open up, let's say, pages, something like this, okay, everything is written in something called as a CS HTML file, and the entire thing is developed, let's say, in something known as a .NET Core language. Now, the issue with that is that it is human readable. Great. It is human understandable language. Like they've used something like public class and all, they've coded all these things. And this is developed in something called as a high level language. High level language, meaning human readable, meaning you and I can read it, right? What are the letters and all, we can read it. But if I give the same to a server, like my virtual machine right now, it won't be able to understand it because it's like a very high level language, and servers out there understand something called as what? Binaries. Or in a greater terminology, or basically in, let's say, in the technical terminology, these are also called DLL. Whenever someone says that DLL, nothing but it's a binary out there. Then how do I really convert it? Like, why do I convert it? Because at the end of the day, I need a server to host this out, right? Then how do I convert it? Now, the process of this conversion from a high level language to, let's say, a binary language out here is known as a process of build. Is known something called as a process of build out here. Then how do I build it? N number of ways. Again, you can use command line and all that stuff, but since Visual Studio already comes with this, I'll say go to the solution file out here, do a right click and say build the solution. As and when I do it right, what happens is that it'll understand, hey, okay, fine, this guy wants me to convert the entire code into something called as a DLL, and it says, okay, fine, I will build it out. Since it's like build is 0 because we've already built it out, it says 1 up to date and all that stuff. It says I will build it, and at the end I have given you something known as a DLL. Now you can take this DLL, you can now start deploying this DLL, or you can start releasing this DLL out onto a web server, meaning I am ready right now. And guys, the process that we did, right, we clicked here, we came here and we say right click and did a build solution out here, right? This is a manual process, and if we are going to automate it, that is called as a CI pipeline, continuous integration pipeline in Azure DevOps. So we technically use DevOps for just automating the entire process out there. Just a very high level overview on what you're going to do in DevOps out there. So right now we did a manual procedure called build out here. We said, okay, fine. We build things out. We are ready. Now I want to take this where? To my server that I have created on the Azure portal. Let me take this all code out. Let me delete this out. I say delete, great. Now I want to do what? I want to publish my code to the Azure server or the Azure virtual machine that I created. How do I do it? Click on this particular file out here, do a right click here and say publish. It's now asking, hey, you know what? Okay, fine, I will publish it, but can you tell me what the target is? Like I have a lot of things out here. I can also basically publish on something known as an on-premises machines. Can you tell me what your really target is? I'll say, you know what, my target is Azure because that's the cloud that I'm using. I'll say next. I'll say it is a Windows virtual machine. It's a virtual machine basically that I'm using out there. Okay, fine. It'll say, okay, fine. Give me the details out here. Now I haven't signed into the account, so I can say sign in. And I can give the account details out here. And it will say, okay, fine, I'm signing you into it, and all that stuff. And it signed me into it. Now I'll say just enter my credentials out here. Akila, can you give me a code basically that I'm about to send it to your email? Like, are you there on the call? Sorry.
Yeah, yes, I'm giving.
Sure. I'll just send the code to your email. So just give me the code here so that I can sign in. Okay. Okay, so I just enter the code basically into, let's say, the particular server, and now I am logged in. And I'll say this is great, not a problem. I have logged in out here. It's reflecting right now and say back. Okay, fine. I'll say next. Microsoft account, this one. So finish. Okay, not a problem. I'll say specified. Cancel. Let me do a publish again because that had some issues there. So I'll say publish again. I don't need this publishing profile. I'll say a new publishing profile out here. I'll say Azure again. I'll say virtual machine out here. And now it says, okay, fine. What is the Azure virtual machine that you actually want to deploy? Like in this particular subscription, I have only one virtual machine right now, which is called VM sample. I'll say, yes, this is where I want to publish my application. And I'll say, okay. And it's now giving me an error, telling me that the specified virtual machine does not have a domain associated with it. Guys, one thing you'll have to remember out here is that we are dealing with an infrastructure as a service, meaning we are dealing at what? A hardware level out here. Now in yesterday's diagram, this is how it was. And the bottom layer of it is what? Is the infra layer. And what all did we get in the infra layer? We got the hard drive, RAM, all these things we selected. But again, see, this code again is on a high level language. And I was able to build this code and I was able to get displayed, let's say, a web page on my local machine because I had something called as a .NET SDK. I had something called as a .NET runtime. I had something known as a .NET runtime along with my operating system, OS and runtime, which helped my operating system to get an understanding of what the code is. So what does the .NET runtime do on my local machine is that it compiles the code, meaning it converts the code into a language that the operating system can understand. This is what we were doing yesterday. I mean, this is what we were checking out yesterday. Where is that deep dive? Not this one. Yeah, this one. RAM and everything. And I said IIS and runtime out here. Now I am dealing with the second layer. Until and unless I do not have a runtime out there, meaning I do not have a .NET runtime out there, I won't be able to complete this entire deployment. I won't be able to achieve this entire deployment out here. I won't be able to do this out there. Okay. So what am I going to do is that for this deployment to get completed, for this particular deployment, meaning for me to deploy this code onto that particular virtual machine, I need to do a couple of things. These are the list basically what I need to do. There is a few things that I need to do on the Azure side of things. And there are a few things that I need to do on the virtual machine. Not a few things, but a good amount of things on the virtual machine. Now, what I will do firstly I will talk about the virtual machine right now. I'll firstly do install IIS and management services on the VM. This is done, which is our first task. Secondly, this virtual machine should allow remote connections, meaning remote connections here, meaning a deployment from my local machine to that particular virtual machine. And it uses a technology called as web deploy. And that particular technology called web deploy listens on a port called port 8172. So we need to allow this. This is the second step. How do we do it? Come here. Okay, where was that? Management services. Where is that? Okay, management services. And I will say enable remote connections. Right now it is disabled. So I will say enable remote connections over something called as a port number 8172. This is the port that gets opened for a remote connection. Meaning if I have to deploy some code from my local machine onto this particular server, I need this port to be open. I'll say apply. After application, it's going to restart this particular service and I'll say start, and this is done. So this was my step number 2. That I install, or basically I allow something known as a remote connections over port 8172 as such. Third thing is that I'm dealing with this layer, right? So for my virtual machine, in order to understand that particular code, it needs something known as a .NET runtime, because that's a .NET code basically that I'm using. Right. So what I'll do is I'll say I'll install a .NET framework on that particular virtual machine, a .NET core framework on this particular virtual machine. So what I do is I'll just come here. I'll go to the Internet Explorer and say ask me later. And now I'll say .NET core 3.1. Says you're about to this one. I'll say okay, I'll do all this stuff. Now no matter how many times I do it, right, it will keep throwing me this particular error, because guys, this is not a normal machine. This is like a server. This is, let's say, a server that I'm dealing with right now. So in order to make sure that my life gets easier, what I'll do is I'll go to this particular server, go to the local server, and this is the feature that is blocking me out here right now, IE security enhanced configuration. I'll just say turn this off. because I'm now working on this particular machine. So just turn this off for now. I'm good with this. I'll come here and I will just go to, let's say, the Microsoft documentation, like the first link, download .NET Core 3.1. I'll just come down out here. It's a Windows operating system I'm working on, and this is the latest .NET Core framework or the runtime. I'll say download the hosting bundle. I'll say run, and I'll say accept this terms and conditions, and I install something known as a hosting bundle out there. Meaning this is the layer that I'm right now working on. I need something known as a runtime so that my virtual machine can compile the code that I'm giving it. And my local machine, right, the machine that I'm working on, it has a .NET SDK installed when I installed the Visual Studio, code. I mean the Microsoft Visual Studio out here. But this machine doesn't have it. So I said I'll install this out. That is my third step. I installed something known as a .NET Core bundle. Secondly, I am deploying the entire code using a technology called what? Web deploy. I also need that particular technology or to that particular piece of software on this particular virtual machine. So I'll say web deploy 3.6. That's the latest that I know of. Let me close this out and let me open the browser again. Download web deploy 3.6. It says, okay, fine, this is Microsoft official website. And I'll say visit this particular website out here. And I'll say download. This was the first link, guys. And this is a 64-bit architecture, meaning this is a 64-bit operating system. I'll say, okay, fine. Next. And I'll say allow once, not a problem. I'll say run. Now this will do a security scan and all that stuff, and this will start basically installing something called, as this is right now installing something known as a Microsoft Web Deploy 3.6 machine out there. So it's like running a security scan right now. It's running a security scan, so it's fine. Should have turned this off so that yes. Now this is done. It says okay, fine. I'll say next, accept, next, complete installation, install. That's the only thing that I'm doing. So it's a very simple, straightforward procedure to go ahead and install this out. And I am done with the Azure side of things. Sorry, the virtual machine side of things. Now, there are a few things on the Azure side of it, what I need to take care of. Firstly, allow something known as 8172 out there. So what I'll do is like I'll go to the portal. I do not have something called as a DNS name label. So what I'll say, okay, fine, configure something known as a DNS name label. It will take me to my public IP address. I'll say give a name label out here. And I'll say test name label deploy something unique so it doesn't throw me an error. And this is present. And I'll say save. So all I'm doing right now is giving something known as a DNS name label to my virtual machine. So my deployment can go. And I'll say this is a static assignment. I need this to be static. And it says, the associated virtual machine may reboot and stuff like that. That which is okay. It says, it cannot update right now because the virtual machine is like, in a running state and all that stuff. So I now have something called as DNS name label out here, which will get displayed something like this. So nothing but this resolves to this particular IP. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the networking. I'm going to go into my network interface card, into IP configurations, into the IP, and I will say this is a static IP assignment, and I'll save this out. So I am making sure to give a DNS name label and making my IP a static one. I don't want a dynamic IP, meaning every time I refresh my machine, I'm gonna get a new IP out here. I do not want that. I need a static IP assignment. And once this is done, I'll go ahead and perform the final step to allow something called as a port 8172 at an infrastructure layer. Now, the one that you did basically earlier into the virtual machine, you went into the virtual machine, allowed a remote connection, right? That is opening the port at the operating system layer. This is the layer on which you opened it out. And at an infrastructure layer also, I need to do the same thing out. So this is done. It made a static IP assignment. And now say, okay, fine, I want to add a rule. Any custom port is 8172. Protocol is TCP. Action is allowed. Priority is like 310. I'll go by default with this. I'll say add. This is also done. So on the virtual machine side, what all we did, guys? We installed IIS done, allowed remote connections done. Third step, we went ahead and we put in something called as a hosting bundle done. Install web deploy done. On the virtual machine side, assigning something known as a DNS name label done. Static IP done. Allowing a port called done. So all these things are like done out there. Now I'll come here and I'll say, okay, fine. I need a new profile out here. I'll say publish. I'll say Azure virtual machine. And now it's not giving me any error. It's now not giving me any error out there. Earlier it was giving a lot of errors, and if we wouldn't have done the entire procedure, your deployment wouldn't go at all. I'll say finish, and it will now go ahead and create me something known as a publishing profile out here. And what I'll do here is I'll say, okay, fine, show all settings, and I will say connection, test user. I'll give my password out here, the one that I've given, when I was creating it. Publish method web deploy, save password, validate this connection. It's going to give you a server certificate, accept it. And if your password is right, it's like, going to do a validation connection is successful. I'll say save. And one final thing, just to make sure that my deployment is clean, I will say file publish option, remove additional files at the destination, meaning whatever is there at the destination, please remove it out. I don't need it. I'll say save. Now I'll say the last thing I'll do is I'll say publish. Now it says the build is started. It will now say, what the target is, any CPU. And now it is publishing, meaning it is building my code firstly, meaning converting my code firstly into something called as DLL and deploying it out or shooting it out to the target. And it says, what an error occurred, the build failed, check out the output and all that stuff. If I click OK, it says, what, there was an issue with the server certificate. The web deployment failed because there was an issue with the server certificate and all that stuff. Now, this is a very common issue that I have faced, especially with, let's say, Visual Studio 2019. This was not available, let's say. I mean, what is happening right now is that my machine is not able to trust the certificate of this particular machine. Now, there is something called a certificate and all that stuff. Now, it is not able to trust the certificate. So in order to get around it, what I did is this is the profile, basically what it's giving me. This is nothing but an XML file. And what I did is, like, after a couple of Googling, right, I got these two things out here. So I'll just say take this out and I'll give you all this, not to worry. I'll just put this in. And this one also, allow trusted connection. I mean, allow untrusted certificate is true, meaning I am basically allowing the certificate to go through. I'll say save. I just save this out. Let's publish again. Let's say publish. See guys, now it's trying to build the code and it's trying to publish the code into what? www root, into the root folder of that particular remote machine out there. And it said, you know what, I'm done, I'm successfully published at this one. And the only thing that I did right now additionally was to go into my publish profile and kind of add this out. This especially is this is causing an issue with, let's say, Windows Server 2019 version. I mean the Visual Studio 2019 version. Now if I go into, let's say, my virtual machine, the same code that was there on my machine, on my local machine, is now getting on top of the server. One thing while you're practicing this, guys, is please follow the same steps what I did. If you're not following the same steps, right, the installation will not be successful and you'll start getting a lot of errors out there. Same steps, meaning here I am dealing with the second layer of my infrastructure. I am dealing with the PaaS layer, which is my responsibility to make sure that there is something known as a runtime on there. There is something known as IIS, and all this procedure is done. Only then you will be able to go ahead and deploy the code on top of your virtual machine. Guys, is this clear? Now this, I mean, you might need to look at this particular video again to understand what we're doing. And in all likely, being a DevOps engineer, you will not do this at all. But why do I teach this? Is because it is it's very important to understand from a developer's perspective that what are they trying to do and what is the error they're getting, so that we can troubleshoot the same thing out. So this is the entire procedure of what we are really going to do out there, let's say in a real-time scenario, especially when you're doing a manual deployment. Guys, is this okay? Any questions here, guys, on any step?
Do we need to have Visual Studio to test this out?
Yes, you'll need to have a Visual Studio to test this out, but I would suggest not to go for Visual Studio because this is like a very big software, and if you do have like good amount of internet connection and good amount of space on your computer, go for it, not a problem. But if you're not willing to install it, this video will suffice it. The entire video is going to suffice the entire procedure. But just in case if you want to install Visual Studio, this is the procedure. Like this is on a virtual machine, so just type in Visual Studio 2019. Not this one, sorry. Go to the Microsoft link, which is visualstudio.microsoft.com. Download Visual Studio. Come on. Stuck. Okay, download Visual Studio Community Edition. Don't go for a professional and all. That is like a licensed version of it. So don't go for a professional. Go for a Community Edition. Just say run, and this is going to start the installer out there. It's going to start the installer out there, and it's gonna say what are all the workloads that you want to install. This is very important, guys. So like the installation will be done in a second right now, but this is actually a very big software. So if you guys want to install it, not stopping you all, definitely go ahead and install it out so that you can try things out. Go for a community edition, and you'll need to install something known as a workload. So what is the workload? I'll just tell you in a minute. So this is done. This is the first page you get while installation. Select ASP.NET .NET and web development, Azure, desktop development, and do we need anything else? Not really. Yeah, Visual Studio extensions development, that's it. These are the three things you need to select. So I mean, four things that you need to select: ASP.NET web development, Azure development, .NET desktop development, and extensions out here, just for keeping yourself updated. This is gonna take around somewhere around 12.08 GB of it. I mean, just for this particular demo, you can as well go ahead and use a virtual machine to, go ahead and do that, without uh, having to install it on your local machine. So once you install it, it's gonna take like, if you're on a virtual machine, it'll be very pretty quick. It'll be like in 5-10 minutes. But if you're, let's say, on your local machine, right, it's gonna download like about 12 GB of this one. So it's gonna take like about 1.5 hour basically, depending upon, let's say, the bandwidth on you're on, like the internet bandwidth that you're on. So this is the procedure from a developer's perspective, guys. Like how do they develop a code? How do they convert the code into something known as binaries? And how do they deploy it on top of something known as a virtual machine? So this was my target on Azure. Guys, any questions here, guys? Anything?
Kiran, for each and every service you create in virtual machine, we need to open the port number always.
I'm sorry, I didn't get your question. I'm sorry.
For each and every service you create in virtual machine, we
Mhm.
need to open different port numbers
Yes, we need
every
to
time.
open different. Yes, we need to open different port numbers every time, depending upon what service that you are using. Like now, I
So
opened
where we
something known
get
as, yeah.
that information in real time? No, where
Sorry.
we going to get the where we are going to get that information in real time? I mean, for this service, we need to open this port number.
So the answer is very simple. Googling it out.
Oh,
Just say
okay.
Google things out. That's gonna help you out. So actually, there are
Okay,
a
Kiran.
lot of port numbers, but mostly what we're concerned about is, when we are especially dealing with, let's say, a DevOps job, right? We're concerned with HTTP, which is 80, HTTP is 443, 3389 is RDP, and if you're, let's say, working on a SQL Server 1433, these are the port numbers what you're mainly concerned about. And since you're going for a web deploy here, it is 8172. So this
Oh,
gets, you'll get used to it when you kind of work on this out.
okay. One more thing. I
Mhm.
created one storage account.
Okay.
Initially, I selected the hard drive, and later on, I changed the hard drive to cool and then to archive, and then
Mhm.
I rehydrated back to hard drive.
Mhm.
So the next day, uh, I tried to change the zone from LRS to JRS, but I'm
Mhm.
not able to convert. I'm getting the message like ARQ, ARKU cannot be created when blobs are in archive status. But blobs are not in archive status, they're in hard tape.
I will have to see that, Sridhar. I'll have to see that specifically what is that happening. So I mean, I'm not able to get what is the error that you're getting. I'm not able to imagine what is the error that you're getting. So I will check that on my end.
Okay.
Okay. Guys, any more question, guys?
At last, you opened the website right in the Chrome.
Mhm.
So it was, what was that? I mean, yeah, that website. So it was like
So
outside the web server.
outside the web server, I didn't get you. I'm sorry that. I'm sorry for that.
Outside of the server, I mean, it was like only just a Chrome.
Oh, this one. Oh, this is an incognito
Yeah.
window. So like this is like an incognito window I basically use. So what happens is like, when I use my browser or alt, right, it'll cache a lot of things. So in order to avoid it, I just said this one and said incognito. And this will just open up an incognito window where your cache is not tracked.
No, which means we opened this Chrome, we opened the website, right? Not in the server, right? Not in the RDP server, right?
No, no,
Only
not in the
just
RDP
outside
server.
the Chrome.
Yeah,
Yeah.
outside your room, like not in the RDP server. We did not do an
Okay.
RDP session out there. So
Hmm.
this IP, right, if I give it to anyone, like anyone in the world, like if I even publish it out here in the message out here, and if you basically click on this, you will get the same page what I'm seeing.
Yeah.
Meaning this
Yes.
website is like accessible over the internet. And to avoid that error, right, I'll just post this particular document out or just post this particular message out here in the chat. If you all guys are interested, you can take this entire thing and try it out. Just in case if you get that error. If you don't get that error, something called certificate and all that stuff, you're good. Like I initially got an error like this. Not this one, that error went off, so fine. Any further questions, guys, before we close the session for today? Anything, guys? And guys, one more request. Please make sure that you are reading documentations after each and every class. Practice the class and read documentations, because as and when we move into the syllabus, right, things are going to get a little bit complicated. And I will try my best to make sure that it is condensed in a very condensed version, and I'll try to give it to you all. But your duty is please read the documentations, because we are only like connecting for 1 hour session every day, and it's very important for you all to go ahead and read the documentations and understand what's going behind the background. So please read the documentations, and if there are any questions, please do ask me. And when you're doing it right, don't just see the video and just replicate what I'm doing. Read the video for your understanding and try it on your own. If you're getting errors, that is actually good. When you get an error, please Google it or please write it down somewhere, because this is very, very important on a real time, guys. Like on a real time scenario, you will deal with errors on a daily basis. Like no matter what, you will deal with 100 errors on a daily basis. Believe me, that is true. Like every day you resolve something out there, and resolutions are like each and every error is new for us. So even we kind of Google it out, see what is the resolution, what someone did, we try it out, and then we kind of document this out. So please make sure to read as and when possible, and please try out. If you are getting a lot of errors, that is good. Please get errors, please Google it out. Even before you ask me, please Google it out. Like Google how many of errors that you want, you Google it out, read it, understand that. If you still don't understand it, please reach out to me, I'll help you out. So that was about how do you deploy the code, guys. And from tomorrow we'll see more on the virtual machines part, how to back up and all that stuff. So we'll continue our journey with the virtual machines, guys. So that's it from my end, and have a great day ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.